Hello everybody and welcome to the SQF Edition 9 Ask Us Anything webinar. My name is Leanne Chuboff and I'm the Vice President of Technical Affairs at SQF, and I will be the host for this webinar. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are, we're happy to have you with us. So this webinar is the Ask Us Anything webinar on Edition 9, and it's true, you can ask us anything. However, to start the conversation, we're going to focus on two specific areas within Edition 9 and the changes within Edition 9, food safety culture and internal laboratory testing and sampling methods. So I'm not alone in this webinar. We have two outstanding panelists with us who will share their expertise and knowledge as it relates to their industry, and I will start from left to right in the introductions. The first is Ann Cooper, and Ann is the Food Technical Manager at Eagle Certification Group, and she's been in this position for the last 12 years, and prior to that, she actually worked for a large quick service restaurant chain in auditing and compliance to corporate food safety and quality, and I've previously worked with Ann actually when I was with the National Restaurant Association, so I have been working with Ann for almost 20 years now. But with for the first 20 years of her career, Ann was with Cornell University and the University of Florida in their cooperative extension program in food safety education. So she has a really good long background in food safety and food safety education, and Ann has a bachelor's of science degree in food science and an MBA. With that, we also have with us today Kathy Crawford, and Kathy is the president of HACCP Consulting Group. Prior to that, though, she's had a long, extensive industry as well, working in manufacturing as well as training. So she worked for a meat and poultry processing company for about 10 years and then joined HACCP Consulting Group, where she is one of our all-star trainers that we have at SQF. She has a master's in food safety from Michigan State, and she also was an auditor for several years, but then changed her focus to consulting and training for SQF, HACCP, FSMA, and other food safety systems as needed. So both Ann and Kathy, they participate in our SQF Technical Advisory Council. They sit and represent Eagle as a certification body and HACCP Consulting Group as one of our training centers. So they bring a wealth of knowledge, not just in their background and industry experience, but also as it relates to the application of the SQF program. Both of them are very well versed in Edition 9 and the changes to Edition 9. So we're very lucky that they are here sharing their industry knowledge with us today during this webinar. So today's agenda, as I said, it's an Ask Us Anything webinar, and the opportunity really is to ask us anything, but our focus is to key in on the food safety culture and the internal laboratory testing and methods, specifically proficiency testing. So we'll take those in those two orders. So first is food safety culture. And the food safety culture requirements that we have in Edition 9 actually aren't new. So they were embedded into 8.1. They weren't called out specifically as food safety culture, but management commitment is forefront in section 2.1 of the SQF code. It's their commitment in the policy statement to supply safe food. It's their commitment to establish and review the site's food safety objectives. It's the commitment to supply and provide the necessary resources and competencies to support the SQF system, and then also training and communication to ensure that staff has the appropriate training and that that the communication comes from the top down and the middle up and the bottom down and the full circle of communication. So that's always been in the SQF code. Management commitment has always been first and foremost. In Edition 9, GFSI posed in their benchmarking requirements a separate section for food safety culture. And we took that as, let's add our own section for food safety culture, our own commitment areas for food safety culture. And that's what we have provided in Edition 9. So Edition 9 clarifies food safety culture and where it fits, and it also adds additional clarity to this to the food safety culture commitment. The commitment to establish and maintain that food safety culture. So what does the site do in order to ensure food safety culture and those norms and beliefs and those values that is shared from senior management is then disseminated down to the rest of the organization. The commitment to have management support and leadership towards food safety culture, for employees to have positive encouragement and empowerment to address food safety concerns, stop a line or bring up an issue, resolve problems, and have that encouragement to do so. Also added is organizational alignment, and where is the organizational aligned in order to support food safety culture in that organization. So there isn't a defined line that is in the code, but there needs to be some type of opportunities to raise food safety concerns that is encouraged. So it kind of rolls up to that third bullet on the right-hand side under Edition 9. And then also the measurement of culture-related performance. So what are those objectives and what are the measurements in order to ensure that those objectives are made? So within the SQF code in Edition 9, there's the policy statement, and then there's also the actual commitment to food safety culture, and then the organizational alignment. And then we don't want to forget about the quality code. And the quality code also has a commitment to the quality culture within that site. So if you are certified to the SQF quality code, there needs to be a means to implement, maintain, and continuously improve that quality culture within the site as well. So starting from the policy statement, that policy statement needs to have a statement on the establish and maintain that food safety culture within the site. So that is part of the site's policy statement right now. 2112 talks about the lead and support of food safety culture. It looks at the establishment of documentation and communication, the adequate resources are available, practices and the applicable requirements of the system are adopted and maintained, employees are informed and held accountable for their food safety and regulatory responsibilities. Employees are positively encouraged and required to notify management about actual or potential food safety issues. And employees are empowered to act to resolve food safety issues within their scope of work. So in their 2112, the requirements are spelled out in the SQF code as to what the expectations are for the site in order to demonstrate implement and demonstrate food safety culture within their organization. 2113 talks about the reporting structure and specifically the responsibilities for tasks within the food safety management system, and includes the identification of backup personnel. But 2113 to ensure that it's organizationally aligned to meet those food safety objectives. And then under the quality code 2113, again, ensuring that the quality culture is not forgotten and that there are components of the quality culture that is going to be demonstrated within the site itself. And so with that, I will hand this over to Kathy Crawford, and she's going to talk more about the implementation and some tips that you can have at your site in order to implement and demonstrate food safety culture. Kathy?
Thank you, Leanne. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about food safety culture and how that fits in with your food safety system, particularly because this can be difficult for companies and it may be difficult to approach for auditors as well, because in some sense, culture talks about beliefs and values and feelings, and it doesn't feel so objective as some of the other parts of the code. So we're going to talk about one way or a few tips on how you might comply with this section. First of all, it's essential to recognize that food safety and culture are interdependent. One impacts the other. You have a system already in place that defines various actions and outcomes that are expected, but culture influences that system because it kind of underpins it or supports it, and it determines how things are done and how well things are done. And in turn, your existing system supports culture because it provides plans and resources for management to help promote that culture. So we go back to where this came from. Essentially, in all other editions of the code, culture was there, and it was under management commitment, and there were requirements to state our commitment to supply safe food or safe products for packaging. And we had to state how we were going to do that and how we were going to improve, and there had to be commitment toward objectives. That was already there. The concern was relatively shallow compliance. Not always, but in many cases, policy statements were words about commitment. And employees learned some of the words. And many of these statements were essentially the same. They listed how they're going to achieve compliance through HACCP and how they were going to achieve continuous improvement through routine meetings. They had objectives, but they weren't always about food safety. And there wasn't a depth to it, not an indication of what a company really values. And what we're trying to move towards by addressing culture is understanding the core of a company and who they are as a potential business partner. So we have to look at how to establish culture and what's required by the code. So it says we have to establish and maintain a food safety culture. So at a minimum, the easiest thing you can do is add this concept to your policy. Incorporate the word culture. But that doesn't mean much unless you further define that commitment to establishing shared values, beliefs, and norms that affect mindsets and behavior towards safer processes or products. And that definition comes from the SQF Code Glossary as well as from GFSI. So we need to dive in a little bit more and see what this means. The easy part is establishing norms and demonstrating that you're meeting them. You're already doing that. You have SOPs, you may have critical control points, you certainly have good manufacturing practices or good agricultural practices, whatever is applicable to your sector. Share evidence that those things are documented and emphasized, and that's the beginning of demonstrating this food safety culture. But then there's the harder part, beliefs and values. There should be, and this is my opinion and my approach, this isn't code, I want to remind you of that. But there should be a mechanism where your company can evaluate your current values, where you are today, and where you want to be on this journey toward a stronger food safety culture. Saying you have a food safety culture is rather generic. But if you could identify specific values, that's going to make it easier for you to work towards specific goals and demonstrate them toward compliance. So you might identify that your company focuses on teamwork, or your company focuses on pride, or your company focuses on structure, discipline, order. Whatever attributes or values would work for you could be identified, and I would recommend you choose only one or two. Define, document, and communicate that these are the values you want to support as part of your food safety culture. And then you would maintain that culture, measure that culture, maybe through surveys and training sessions, and facilitate that culture. And as we're doing this, it's going to be important that management shows leadership. And these steps that we take should be small and realistic. If you think back to maybe when your company was first SQF certified, your original goal was to just get certified. And then as your system matured, your goals were more detailed and stronger and focused. And the same thing's going to be true with culture. This year, as we move into 2021 and edition 9, the goal might be just to establish a culture program. And there is really no perfect. Auditors aren't going to expect a perfect culture. They're going to expect to see objective evidence that you're on the journey to create and maintain and support a food safety culture in your own way. So once these things have been identified within the company, you need to communicate them through training and through routine meetings, maybe your monthly meetings between the practitioner and management, and also meetings all through the organization, and then measure your results. And that can be done just by interviews or documenting what you see in terms of how people promote, respond to, and exhibit the values that your company has selected as part of your food safety culture. So the objective evidence could be training records or results on feedback forms. And then once you get those results, maintaining the system means responding to results. So you might, again, document those meetings and how you review results and look for trends, maybe adjust your approach over time, increase or alter your methods for training, and change directions if you need to show that you're seeking to meet these measurable goals that you set up for your own culture. So culture is what I would call an inescapable journey. You are in it whether you recognize it or not, but now it's part of the code. So the journey is to intentionally shape your existing culture toward a food safety culture and demonstrate this by declaring and sharing specific, if you can, values and beliefs, reinforcing those attitudes and behaviors that come from those beliefs, empowering and engaging your employees, and working toward improvement over time. So if there are questions about culture and how to achieve culture, we'll address those. And soon after, we will change gears toward addressing the laboratory methods and sampling methods requirements that are part of the upcoming Edition 9 implementation.
I do want to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. So a couple questions regarding the checklist and the Excel sheet that defines the primary response, the basic checklist that you all could do, specifically about the checklist and when they'll be available. I have good news on that. We're finalizing the checklist right now, so they should be posted soon, within days, to our SQF website. We're working on posting them actually this afternoon, so they should be ready at any time. So the checklists are getting ready to be posted, as well as the change document. So the change documents for the key codes for food manufacturing, storage and distribution, food packaging, and primary have been completed, and those will be posted as well. All the other guidance documents, updated tip sheets, that's in a work in progress right now, and those should be completed and be posted by the beginning of 2021. But you can start on conducting your own internal audit to Edition 9 as soon as those checklists are posted. So those are going to be coming soon, the checklist, and then the rest of the documents beginning of 2021. The other questions that we had is if this webinar is going to be recorded and the presentation provided, and it will. So you'll have all this information available to you. And then the other question was regarding translations. So the translations will be available, really depends on the language. So the question specifically was Spanish, and that will be available by end of March. Those have all been submitted into our translation team, and it's in the process of being translated. So we had to wait until Edition 9 was published, and now we can send them out to translations. So unfortunately, Spanish is the biggest bulk of what we get translated, and it's going to take just a little bit longer to get all those codes published in its language. So Spanish by the end of March. We also translate into French Canadian, we translate into Japanese and Chinese and Portuguese. Those will be completed by mid-February. So again, it kind of depends on the different language that you have. So a couple questions regarding food safety culture. I do have a question real quick for you, is what's the number one thing that a site can do right now to determine if their food safety culture will meet the expectation of SQF? What can they do?
Yeah, I think the first thing you need to do is establish where your culture is today and interview your employees and ask them what they think the company values. And if they don't say food safety or they don't say the things you're looking for, like attention to detail, then that sets your sense of sense of direction. Yeah. You can't really embark on this until you know where you are today.
No, I think that's a great idea. I mean, maybe not just even your employees, but senior management. Ask everybody that question, right? And that will give you a baseline of where you think you are and actually where you are. And so you kind of get an idea of where you need to start, right? I think that's a great way to kick it off, is get an understanding of where you are by including all the employees up and down the ladder. So great idea. So from a documentation standpoint, what do you think they need to start reviewing from a documentation standpoint?
We'll certainly look at your policy and show that it includes culture, or at least the term culture. And then further define that on your own to say, at our company, we define food safety culture based on, and then you choose the attributes that maybe you want to focus on that year, and then demonstrate in your monthly meetings or training activities that you are looking at that culture.
Yes. So so one way that to demonstrate to an auditor for your food safety culture is to put that perhaps part of your conversation in your monthly meetings as an SQF practitioner. So understanding, maybe you develop a measurement point or have an idea of where that topic would be in your conversation with the senior site management. So excellent, good ways of kicking off that program and then measuring that program. And I think some of the chat it seems like such an abstract requirement. How do you pin it down? Like, what's the best way of kind of pinning that down, and you know, how do you take an abstract requirement and make it into something tangible?
I think that's the hardest thing for us because we're so used to black and white evidence, and this is different. If it were my company, I would take a one-page sheet of paper and list different values, positive and negative, and ask employees to anonymously report what do you think are the top 5 that are going on in our company today. And that way you can show you're looking for feedback, you're looking to understand these values that are there, and then you can look at where you are and then choose where you want to go. And it really helps to narrow it down by looking at a specific attribute rather than just saying food safety in general terms.
Right. Yeah. So put it down, get some feedback from employees, understand where you are, where you need to be. I think that's all great advice to get things going. I really do like the bit of advice, though, in the beginning, and I don't know if some of the people on the line, some of us said they didn't hear you, but it was about getting employees involved in the beginning, getting an idea, asking them specific questions, you know, about food safety culture, but what kind of questions would you ask your employees, you know, because sometimes we're so specific on language, but it's not about the language, it's about the culture. So what kind of questions would you ask those employees in the beginning?
I think it requires some bravery, and you have to be willing to ask the question, like on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you rate a 1 versus a 10? Is it shipping product out the door, or is it checking food safety things first? You know, and sometimes those questions are hard to ask, and we don't want to ask, but we need
Right. No, that's a good one. Yeah, so exactly. Those are good questions. Very good. So the questions that you ask may take they're courageous. They're called courageous questions in a sense, where they're questions that you might not want to know the answer. So the question could be on a scale of 1 to 10, what's more important, shipping product out the door or food safety in your environment? And it's asking those hard and difficult questions to get a baseline as to understanding where you are in overall in your culture, in your environment, to see where you need to go and where you need to start. You know, if it's at the leadership level, is at the employee level, is at the education level, but getting an understanding of where you currently are, it gives you a better sense of the direction you need to be in. So that those are really good good advice. Any other just overall advice if you were back in your manufacturing site and you were received Edition 9 and food safety culture all over again, what would be your overall advice as it relates to this particular requirement?
I think the bottom line with this is to recognize that for most companies this is new, and you just have to demonstrate that you are starting. There really is no perfect, but you have to show that you are starting on this journey to define culture and shape culture.
Exactly. Very good. All righty. Well, thanks, Kathy. If you guys have any suggestions or ideas for food safety culture, put them in the chat. If you have any other questions on food safety culture, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And with that, we're going to go on to our next topic, which is internal laboratory requirements, specifically about in-house laboratory testing methods, proficiency testing, and also the external laboratory requirements. So, as you know, this was an addition, and I do want to state too that this is also GFSI, so it's applicable across any of the benchmark standards that are out there. But new to SQF is internal laboratories or testing, and where testing and sampling or product analysis is conducted for food safety. There are applicable requirements of 17025 that must be applied, and this includes the annual proficiency testing. So we want to go over what type of testing does this include, what parts of 17025 might apply, and the expectation of proficiency testing. So one of the things, you know, where testing, what testing is included, it is within the certification scope for food safety. So it's just as it applies to food safety requirements, and it includes product testing, environmental inputs as it relates to it, and then also there is a good definition within the glossary. And so with that, I want to bring up Ann Cooper, who can speak more on this particular section. And while Ann is getting ready to talk, I do want to talk about the quality code, because there is elements within the quality code itself, but I want to emphasize that proficiency testing is not part of this requirement within the quality code. So, Ann, are you online?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good day, wherever you are in the world. I'm thrilled that you're joining us today. I am by no means an expert on laboratory testing. Let me be perfectly clear about that. But I do know quite a bit about the SQF code and interpreting the code and what it means for you. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So in the new code, 2.4.4.2 does talk about both external laboratories that you might contract with. Nothing's really changed with that requirement. They've always been required to be accredited to ISO 17025. Or an equivalent national or international standard. So when you do business with them, you would expect and articulate that they would need to provide you with a certificate showing that they are accredited to ISO 17025. I assume that certificate expires occasionally, so you'll probably want to put that on your annual verification list to be sure that you have the most current certificate before your next SQF audit occurs. So also in the last version of the code 8.1, proficiency testing for on-site lab personnel had been required, and it is zeroed in only on food safety testing. So quality testing like flavor and viscosity and other attributes like that for quality, you don't need to be concerned about proficiency testing. And we'll get in a minute to what proficiency testing is. So you should include tests based upon impact and based upon risk. So you should be, if you have any doubt, you should be conducting a risk assessment, highly recommended, to help you define your most riskiest tests that you need to perform. Which ones tie into a HACCP CCP, for instance? That would be high risk. Which ones are very important for the safety of the product, the food safety of the product? Which ones measure microbiological or pathogens? Those will be the highest risk items that you should then have your laboratory best practices to control the accuracy of the test and the efficiency of the test and making sure you're obtaining a pure sample. So you'll want to include considerations of the reason for the test and the impact of results if the test is done incorrectly. So for example, if you wanted to go through the scenario that if my listeria testing of my floor drains or my standing water was done incorrectly, that could give me a false negative result for listeria when you may have listeria present, which then could be a potential disastrous result, resulting in recalls and illness and bigger consequences. So we're going to talk a little about how you can take your samples, how you can conduct your testing, and how you can be sure your laboratory inside your facility is operating under good laboratory practices and under the ISO 17025 expectations. So there are lots of different sample types you may need to obtain in your plant based upon your product and your process. They can include raw materials, ingredients, work in process, and some finished product. Water, especially if it's used as an ingredient. Ice, same thing. Air and compressed air if it touches the food or touches the food contact surface or the packaging when the product is packaged. Think about potato chips. You know when you buy a bag of potato chips, it's at least half air in the package? Don't you feel like you're not getting your money's worth? But anyway, the air is there to help the potato chips from breaking in transit, but the air is also interacting constantly with the food inside that sealed package. So that's why compressed air in that situation would be an important component or ingredient, if you will, to test for pathogens to make sure that your compressed air is pure. So the different types of tests that may be included in your food safety testing are pathogen sampling and testing, like I mentioned, Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, and on. And any tests to verify and validate your HACCP CCP limits. Those are very important tests. You must show that your CCPs are in control. And any allergen tests to verify that sanitation occurred properly on changeovers and that pre-op, you may do some swabbing during pre-op to make sure last night's sanitation shift got everything off from the allergen residue before you start up today's non-allergen run. So those are some examples of tests that you would most likely include in your requirement to comply with 17025. Other examples are testing pH of acidified product, because in this case the pH is controlling the risk of pathogenic growth. Testing water activity if it's a critical limit, and testing surfaces for allergen post-cleanup. Some less likely examples that you may not need to test for, but it all depends on your product and your HACCP plan, are calibration checks, checking temperatures of cold storage areas. You'll do those anyway, but this is not part of the requirement to stay with your laboratory processes related to 17025. And I mentioned quality tests such as color, flavor, viscosity. So those are examples of sampling techniques that do not impact risk-related outcomes. So those are clearly quality issues in your product, which are important but not required in the SQF code for food safety to have to comply with ISO 17025. So ISO 17025 is a approximately 35 page document that is an ISO standard on general requirements for competence of testing and calibration of laboratories. You do not need to buy the standard. You do not need to comply with every single line in the standard. But the goal is to demonstrate that you have competence and consistency in your internal lab's sampling and testing methods, not just providing records of completed training or not just providing records of completed testing, and that you participate in proficiency testing where available and appropriate. These other items are addressed in the SQF code elsewhere, and they include calibration, traceability, lab management systems like recording complaints, errors, internal audits, and all of these other components. So that's just telling us that these topics are not part of the requirement in ISO 17025. So the applicable parts of ISO 17025 are proficiency testing. That's where you are going to take your samples that your staff have taken and do double samples, for example, of the same product, and you send one set of samples to an accredited ISO 17025 lab outside of your company to be tested, and you do the exact same test in your lab, and you can compare the results. If there are differences, then you'll need to drill down. I wonder what happened differently. And you may want to compare your sampling procedure or your testing method procedure with the accredited lab. And the lab will usually work with you if they know that you're doing proficiency testing to assist you in a little bit of troubleshooting. They may be able to describe their testing method to you, and maybe you didn't do it quite the same way, or something happened and your sample got adulterated during the process and no one noticed that until you see the results are so different. So you have to do a little troubleshooting. And sampling records should have detail on them so that we know where it was taken from, the time of day, the date, the person who did the sampling, so that you can trace it back and you can know the details of that sample record. And what is expected of proficiency testing? Proficiency testing calibrates the performance of your lab personnel and the in-process testers who conduct microbiological, chemical, or physical analysis of ingredients, materials, work in process, finished products, and the processing environment by means of interlaboratory comparisons. That's just a fancy way of saying you're going to send it to another lab as the same samples and have them both evaluate using the same test methods and compare if there are any differences and try to find out what the differences are. So as I said, you can use a contracted laboratory that is accredited to 17025 if you'd like to do your interlaboratory comparison where your on-site lab performs the same test. Sometimes within a large company, you may have several internal labs and you may have an outside lab within your big umbrella of your company, and you can go intercompany within your company or to a participating company's lab if you wanted to go through a company and not through a certified lab. So this slide is going to tell you how you will be evaluated on an audit. And I know there were questions from some auditors in the chat box about how auditors can evaluate culture and do it fairly. So we'll probably get to that question when I'm done talking about this. But how will you be evaluated as a site being certified? For good laboratory practices, you'll want to have a detailed SOP for your critical food safety tests. explaining the procedure for doing those tests. And you want to have training documented for your personnel. And you want to have identified how often are you testing among your various lab personnel and comparing their results of their accuracy and proficiency between your own team of lab people. Let's say you have 5 lab technicians. A good place to start might be to have all of them do the same test and make sure they're all calibrated. Then when you've got that ironed out, send your sample out to the lab outside of your company and have it checked for accuracy. So the accurate execution of your SOP for the test and the fact that your test aligns with the lab test design. Then if you're using an external lab, you need to verify that they are accredited and they have provided you evidence of 17025 accreditation, and that they are using a method for choosing which tests are sent out. You are using a method for choosing which tests are sent out. Sorry. You'll want to identify which tests you want to send out and which tests you want to do in-house, making sure that if you are still doing any important tests for food safety, for HACCP, CCPs, or anything to do with pathogens, you are still operating under the 17025 requirement umbrella. And in terms of regulatory, do your tests and your processes meet FDA, FSMA, or other country requirements as applicable? So making sure you double check to make sure that whatever regulation you are under at your site, that regulation is being met with your testing methods and your procedures. A little advice here. Never test without a plan to respond to results. Example, a very vigorous testing program for Listeria in drains. We know Listeria grows very, very easily in wet conditions in plants, and those of you who have to use wet cleaning methods have to be very aware of Listeria. If you don't already know, Listeria is a very serious pathogen that can cause lots of health issues and including death of some at-risk people in the general public. So if you are embarking upon an aggressive plan to start testing in different areas, make sure you know in writing how you're going to respond to those results. And what do you do when a negative, or a positive finding of a pathogen is found? Do you just document it and turn the page over for next month's testing and worry about testing it next month? Or do you have an active plan in place to continue retesting, sanitizing, retesting again until you get the problem resolved and the count is down to acceptable levels? So you'll want to set your criteria prior to implementing your testing methods and until your testing activities start, including proficiency testing. So you want to have your criteria for acceptance and failure, your methods written out, and you will then compare them with what you will do when you have a bad result, a negative result. And in case you wanted to be reminded about the edition 9 of the SQF code, audits begin on May 24th of 2021. So today is December 7th, so you have about 5 months to get ready for the code. And we have provided in the resources box for you quite a few links to obtain the code and obtain further information on in-house lab requirements and food safety culture from GFSI, from SQFI, from other sources. So please take advantage of this time now between now and May to get ready and get completely equipped at your plant with adjustments you need to make to your policies, procedures, laboratory testing methods, and other areas to comply. Thank you very much. We'll turn it over to questions now.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have quite the questions in the question box and even a little under the chat box. So I'll start with a couple going back to food safety culture. So Kathy, one is a very interesting question is back to the face-to-face meetings and discussion of food safety culture. How can you do that in times of COVID when there's no face-to-face discussions now? So how else, how else can we start that discussion on food safety culture?
Oh, I think like so many other things, we've learned to do things better long distance and communicate either with Zoom or Teams or other mechanisms, but it doesn't say it has to be face-to-face. The fundamentals are that you determine how you're going to implement culture into your system and declare that you're doing that, and then just start working on the training or communication. And we found that long-distance training, it's never going to be the same as in person, but it still can be effective, and we just have to do that for now. But there isn't a clear requirement that says this has to be face-to-face.
No, you're right about that. Definitely right about that. So I think just starting the discussion. So a lot of conversation about how to demonstrate that food safety culture from the perspective of the auditor. What would they be looking for, as well as what kind of documentation, how could they demonstrate that food safety culture to the auditor from the site's perspective?
I think to make it very simple, I would say there's 3 things you have to do. Number 1, make sure it's in your policy that you have a commitment to food safety culture. That's pretty straightforward. The second one, make sure you have documentation to prove that senior management is involved. And as you're defining your culture, that they had input, maybe during one of your monthly or annual meetings. And I think the third piece is to demonstrate that you're including this at all levels of the organization. And that means you hold employees accountable, or you positively encourage employees. And that could be through training sessions or even annual reviews of employees at various levels. And each of those activities have documentation involved.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I have another suggestion. In the new code, in 2.1.1.2, there are 6 bullet points that almost tell you exactly what to do to assess your food safety culture as a site. The establishment, documentation, and communication to our staff of food safety objectives and performance measures. Are we communicating, in other words? Our food safety objectives and performance measures. That's pretty easy to check. Do we have enough resources to meet our food safety objectives? That could be labor, it could be money for capital expenditures, and money for training. Do we have the ability to conduct training? Do we have all of the resources that we need in order to comply with food safety? And are the food safety practices and all applicable requirements of the SQF system adopted and maintained? And that's where you check yourself on your internal audits or your daily, weekly, monthly checks of your facility. Are the staff of the facility informed and held accountable for their food safety and regulatory responsibilities? So what are the shift managers and what are the production managers telling the staff? Is there a company-wide policy that staff have to be accountable, and they have job descriptions that include what their food safety responsibilities are? That's pretty easy to check too. Look at your job descriptions. The next one is staff are positively encouraged and required to notify management of actual or potential food safety issues. So if we as auditors go around the plant and ask a few people, what do you do if this goes wrong? What do you do if that breaks down? What do you do if the metal detector doesn't reject the product? And if I hear them say, oh, we stop the line and we tell our manager, and I would say, are you allowed to stop the line? And they say, anybody here is allowed to stop the line. That's a good indicator that everybody's empowered to take action immediately when they know something went wrong. And it is good that they say, we reported immediately to the manager on duty, and we stopped the line. Those are little indicators that you've got it ingrained in everybody. What do I do to keep this product safe in my role on my job? So staff empowered to act to resolve food safety issues within their scope of work. So those are the 6 tips that are in 2.1.1.2 that are very helpful. And then also at the SQF Global Conference, end of October, there was a very good slide deck that I'm quoting from, and it tells a lot about what auditors need to do, how auditors should audit to food safety culture. Remembering that food safety culture is a journey, not a destination, so it is an ongoing occurrence, and we're looking for year-on-year continuous improvement. So since this will be the first year that food safety culture will be assessed, we would probably expect sites to be beginning their food safety culture journey and their projects. So we would expect between now and May that sites would start to build culture, like I just described, some of those cultures, into their day-to-day operations. And the auditor is looking to establish that there is a positive program in place which reinforces behavior, good behavior about food safety, and that organizational values and beliefs are shared. Does everybody in your company know your food safety mission statement and your food safety requirements? Is there employee empowerment and engagement? And what might that look like? I've seen many employees who are so passionate about what they do, and they know a lot about food safety. And we have to make sure they can be a model, a role model for others in your organization that might be new, and that you have this way of sharing expertise among each other, and that you can empower employees. You can give them rewards, let it be gift card, pizza party, or whatever. After you have a good internal audit result in a certain department, celebrate it. Have fun, celebrate it, and reward people for doing good behavior. And the auditor is looking for evidence of continuous improvement. So are you improving the number of complaints that you had from last year, or are you improving the number of nonconformances you scored on your internal audit since last quarter, or little ways you have to record changes and improvements? So that's just my 2 cents, but this was a very helpful presentation that I saw at the SQF Global Conference.
Thanks, Ann. There are a lot of questions in the chat, and I know that we are scheduled to end in 2 minutes. So I just want to get some of these questions as well. So as it relates to the internal testing, so there was a question regarding as a packaging manufacturer, our product would impact food safety of the end product due to the functionability of our product, so the functionality of the product itself. So in that case, would functional testing be applicable to meet 17025? So is that one of their food safety tests that they would have to do in order to include in that internal testing and sampling requirement?
So it does depend on your product, and if it is only the finished product that you need to verify is free of certain contaminants, let's say, free of oil residues or free of bacteria, it would be unlikely that you would be testing lots of packaging for bacterial presence because the likelihood of growth is so low. But let's say your customer required it, or your customer wanted to make sure there were no oils on the packaging. You could be testing that end product packaging for those presence of items.
If that functionality is to be used for pathogen control or minimizing that type of barrier or whatever it might be, then yeah, I would assume that again, you would have to look to see if that, talk to the next supply chain, but if that is a food safety requirement, then that would be something that you would want to ensure that it's working, if that's what the next layer, the next level is expecting. Another question is for Kathy Crawford. The question, and this is a good one, is how do you change the culture if you need to change the culture? So it's nice to walk into an environment that is food safety culture positive, but how do you change the culture if within the plant itself or within the site itself, if it comes out that the culture just isn't there?
Wow, that's
No.
not an easy question. And a different way of phrasing that question is really, how do you get people to care? And my answer would be through training. People often don't care when they don't understand. Why is it important to do it this way? Well, maybe they don't understand how, if you make a mistake at something, you truly could hurt the consumer. And so more in-depth training, not just go follow the rules, but here's why the rules are in place. Here's why we elected to implement the code and the rules the way we did. And when people understand the whys, they tend to do better. If they still don't do well, you've got to try to use positive and unfortunately negative reinforcement sometimes. And sometimes certain human beings aren't a good fit for a certain job or a certain company, depending on the culture you're building. Like, you know, Southwest Airlines has this reputation for being fun, and so they hire people who fit with the culture or who will adapt to the culture. And sometimes you have to make tough decisions when you can't make that happen, but you always try to work toward it first.
Yeah. Training, I think, and explaining the why. I like that. So, Anne, when you were talking about your proficiency testing and comparing the results, you mentioned that if there would be a significant difference. So the question is, what would be a significant difference between the labs? Are you talking like a 1 log or a 2 log difference within, you know, let's say microbiological testing, or what would you consider a significant difference?
I would say probably a couple of logs difference would be significant, and of course it depends on what the allowance rate is for the specific pathogen you're testing. What is your window? What is your range of allowability within your own definition? And you can also ask a certified lab that. What is their allowance in their certified test for Listeria or Salmonella? What is their range? And maybe you can copy and use the same range so that you are also measuring it to the same degree when you come up with your pass or fail definition.
Okay, good idea. Just to let everybody know, we're going to go a little bit over because there are some really good questions. So hopefully you can keep participating and even chatting in questions. But what we don't get, we'll put together an FAQ sheet and make sure that we post it so that we can still at least respond, at least in writing, to your questions. But we're going to try and get to as many as we can. So another question came in, this is for Anne or Kathy, whoever wants to answer it, but it is about the laboratory testing, specifically in 2442, and I think it's more about clarification of the 17025 versus national test recognized methods for testing. So 2442 talks about that product analysis shall be conducted to nationally recognized methods or company requirements. So we keep referencing the ISO method. So can you explain like the differences between those two, or similarities in some cases as well, but what are the differences between those two when we talk about nationally recognized methods versus the ISO 17025, for example?
Well, ISO is an international standard versus a nationally recognized standard might be a little bit different country by country. So that would be my assumption. I am not a laboratory specialist, but I do know enough about lab testing to know that when you're dealing with anything related to an ISO standard, that is an international global standard. And if a lab wishes to do business in many other countries, they would have to have that benchline ISO certificate to show that their process, their procedures, their equipment, their environment of their lab is not causing any risk to the sample or the results, and it is that they are showing their results are trending toward being accurate results by controlling all of these other factors that can cause a sample to become invalid or adulterated. So everyone has a common baseline for operating their lab if they're 17025. Let's say air filtration is always maintained, environment, dust, electromagnetic, radiation, humidity, temperature, vibration, sound, things like that are going to be more controlled in an ISO 17025 environment.
I'd like to add a little bit to that. The ISO 17025 standard really defines how a lab runs a lab. It's all about good laboratory practices. But under 2442, when we talk about nationally recognized methods, those are the test methods themselves. So you want to make sure they came from a recognized source, like official methods of analysis, the AOAC international publication, or for microtests, it would come from, we always called it BAM, Biological Analytical Manual, I think that's what it was. So you want to make sure the source of information on how to do the test itself is from a recognized source.
Exactly. That's the intent behind that, is that the test method itself, the sampling and test methods themselves are from some nationally recognized method. Specifically, in primary, you might have some challenges as it relates to chemical testing or whatever, but it has to be from a recognized method, and that's exactly what the intent is there. Where 17025 is more about the methodology that you do in order to acquire and ensure you have good laboratory practices, good sampling practices, storage practices, etc. So that's really what 17025 is about. So those are the differences. A couple more questions on, there's a lot of questions actually on testing and sampling methods. So the question about ATP came up, and if ATP would be considered for proficiency testing. So for ATP, and I just kind of want to package it into a couple, but they don't have an internal lab. They don't have an internal lab, but do internal ATP testing and do swabbing for environmental monitoring, and that's sent to an external lab. So how do they do they have to validate the swabbing, or how do they validate the swabbing methods to meet the SQF requirements? So this is in regards to ATP, that they send out the EMP to an external 17025 lab though. So what about the ATP?
So that's good that they're sending out the sample to an environmental testing lab for a plate test or an aerobic count test. So the question is, in general, is ATP testing part of this requirement? I would say it is when it is considered a critical food safety test of your product and your establishment based on your testing protocols and testing requirements. So if you have an ATP program in place and you are not sending it out also for external laboratory testing, environmental testing, then that is really your most important for maintaining controls of materials and effects on your products. But remember, ATP is not a specific test of a pathogen. It is not going to tell you how many parts per million there are of Salmonella or E. coli or Listeria or any pathogen. It's just going to tell you if there's any organic matter on the surface, and that could be dust, it could be food particles, it could be almost anything. So people sometimes get a false sense of security when they're doing ATP testing, but ATP doesn't always help you predict whether there's a pathogen growing there. It's just telling you there are other indicators there that it may grow because there's environmental, some kind of physical material there.
So the question then is one of the questions, and I think it kind of falls into this, whether ATP should be included in your testing, is the question is, can we determine through risk analysis which tests are critical to food safety and need to align to 17025, or does it apply to all laboratory testing?
No, you should use a risk assessment based upon a lot of the hazards and risks identified already in your HACCP plan, if you know you have a CCP and you're doing testing around that CCP to confirm and monitor it, verify and validate that it's working properly, then you know that's a critical one, that you need to have your food safety testing done either at an accredited outside lab or that your inside lab has to be using the good lab practices to ensure that it is conforming to the ISO 17 or 25.
Kathy, do you have anything to add?
So risk assessment is important.
I want to step in and offer a suggestion on ATP because results from ATP testing fluctuate dramatically from one place to another. You have to keep in mind why are you doing it and why is it important. ATP testing is used to determine if a surface is clean or not. So I would suggest one way to approach proficiency testing would to have maybe 6 identical squares of stainless steel, whatever they might be. 2 of the 6 are dirty. You can make them contaminated any way you want. Please don't use pathogens. Don't make them visibly dirty, but make sure 2 of them are different. Send a set of 3 to your internal lab and a set of 3 to some other lab. Ask both labs to identify which disc or square was dirty. And you're just identifying the ability to do this testing correctly and identify that you can tell the difference between clean and not clean.
Yep. Exactly. Good one. So let's move on to a couple other questions not related to food safety culture or internal testing. Couple of questions regarding HACCP training for the substitute practitioner and if that can be conducted online, and I can answer some of these. So yes, we eliminated the 2-day requirement for HACCP training. So, and it doesn't state that the training has to be in person. So really the HACCP training has to be based off of codex. It has to have some type of measurement or assessment to the training, but it can be conducted online. So there isn't the requirement of that 2-day training, and that's kind of where we got that from. The question, another question, and perhaps Anne from a CB perspective, you can answer this one. It says that we are a greenhouse and we pack and ship our product through a marketer to Canada and the U.S. Sometimes we receive third-party product that's pre-packed and we want to ship it through our marketer to the retailers in Canada or the U.S. Do we need SQF storage and distribution certificate as well, or is the primary plant production certificate enough?
If your main role is greenhouse growing and processing of the product, then your greenhouse and your harvesting, I believe, should cover you, but that is a new FSC this year, FSC 2, Food Sector Category 2. Leanne, this FSC code includes just the indoor growing and harvesting of the fresh produce in a greenhouse setting. If their primary business is not distribution, then they shouldn't need to add the distribution code.
Yeah, I would agree. It depends on your scope of certification. So if you wanted to include storage and distribution, again, if storage and distribution is a part of your process, so from receiving to manufacturing to shipping out the product, then that does not need to be a separate FSC. So that wouldn't be distribution of the product does not need to be a separate FSC. However, if you have a distribution business that you also want to include as part of the scope of certification, then that's where, then it could be included as part of your scope of certification. But it does, I would agree with Anne in that if those products aren't included in the scope of certification that you want to be shipping out, then it does not need to be included in there. But if you're, distributing that as a co-manufacturer underneath your brand, then that would need to be included underneath the scope of certification. So talk to your CB about that one in specifics, because there's a lot of unanswered questions in there. Another question came in regarding the recall. So the new requirement in recall is that that the product is tested under different shifts or scenarios or whatever. So In 2632 in food packaging, but it's applicable to all the codes, a new requirement for recall testing is to carry out on products from different shifts and across a range of products. This creates a situation where we'll need to search for an item product that will meet this criteria, which eliminates the randomness of recall testing. We would often have our customers select a job order to perform a mock recall. Any concerns about cherry picking products recurring that would modify the effectiveness of a mock recall test? So are there any concerns about cherry picking products?
I don't think there are any concerns about cherry picking products. Just make sure you're rotating when you select to do your recall, mock recall on a periodic basis. Just rotate from something made from another shift.
I think the intent behind the expansion in the code here is that mock recalls were being done, but companies weren't demonstrating that they were challenging themselves. Remember, your goal isn't to prove that you're perfect. Your goal is to challenge your system and write down what you learn. So you should be looking for difficult scenarios and just seeing how you can do and working toward improvement. And I think that's why the code was expanded.
Yep, exactly. Good. Another question came in regarding the renumbering of the sections. So many of the sections were renumbered. Do they just add the new requirement to their current procedure? So many sites use the numbering of the SQF code to align with their procedures. Do they just add the new numbering to the procedure, or what's the best practice there as it relates to that? Any advice, I guess, for the sites?
My 2 cents is please don't number your documents. If you can keep a single checklist, maybe even the SQF code checklist when you do your internal auditing, and match up document titles with requirements, then you're not going to have to worry so much about slight numbering changes over time, because we know, 5, 6 years from now, I know we're not excited about it, but it might change again. It's not about the numbering, it's about compliance.
Right, and by using the title of the section, such as Crisis Management Planning, who cares if it's 2.6.4 or 2.6.2, really? You and the auditor need to communicate talking about the topic, not about the numbers. And it really works best if you have your whole document system set up by the titles and not so much worried about the clause numbers, because you can always cross-reference them to the free SQF checklist that you have available to you. Yep. If you need to know the number.
Just so you know, I was cheering for you while you said that.
Great feedback. Okay, a question on the new retention period and shelf life. Can shelf life be set by company and be a freshness date? For instance, wine can have a shelf life of 10 years. Do you need to keep the records for 10 years? So the
I would encourage
requirement to those to give background is the shelf life has to the shelf life has to include, or the product dating has to include at a minimum the shelf life of the product. So that's the new testing. So what if the shelf life can be 10 years? Do they have to keep their documentation for 10 years?
I would say yes.
I would agree, but we have to remember to focus on food safety and not quality. So if your food safety attributes are a concern for up to 10 years, well, you better keep records for 10 years.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The code is specific to food safety, so let's just keep that in mind when establishing that. So with that one, regarding customer requirements, what are those customer requirements if there is no set shelf life for food safety? So if there isn't, it wouldn't be applicable, if there isn't a set shelf life for food safety. Another question regarding, can the FSPCA, the Preventive Controls Training, replace HACCP training for FDA regulated products? And actually I will address that. So The two are not the same. So FSPCA that develops the training and the curriculum for the preventive controls, the PCQI training, they're not the same. It's not based off Codex. It's based off the FDA reg. And the training does need to be based off of Codex because you still have to have a HACCP plan in place. Now, can the two be, and it depends which entity you're looking at. So if you're looking to become an auditor, for example, you have to have HACCP training based off Codex. You have to have that. So PCQI is not a substitute for that. As it relates to the SQF practitioner and the backup practitioner, there is an opportunity to use that in FDA sites, but keep in mind that the auditor, it's not a certificate that the auditor is going to check a box and say, here you go. There would have to be some due diligence in there to demonstrate. So you would almost have to do a risk assessment to say this is how PCQI training is equivalent to HACCP training, and that's what you would have to demonstrate to that audit. So it's not a one-on-one direct, it's okay to use, but there is an opportunity to do it. You would just have to demonstrate to the auditor how you're filling in the gaps, perhaps, for that PCQI training. But I do want to say, too, that FSPCA is looking to change up their curriculum to include HACCP based off Codex, more information on HACCP as it relates into their curriculum for PCQI. So there may be opportunity where it will sync up and be recognized by the GFSI benchmarked stakeholder or CPOs. So it's not a direct match. I don't want to say that it is a direct match. A question about in-house laboratory participation in a check sample program and how that would, if that would be equivalent to a proficiency testing. And if you're not familiar what a check sample program means, it means a certified lab sends out samples to a variety of labs for a series of tests. The in-house lab performs the tests and reports the results. Then the certified lab shows them the results in comparison with peer labs. So it's almost like a reverse proficiency testing is how I'm looking at it. Would that meet the same requirement, Anne? What do you think?
Certainly sounds like it would, because you're still getting outside professional certified laboratories to verify results and compare results. So I think it would.
I agree. I worked in a lab for a while, and those interlaboratory tests are just as challenging as a proficiency test, and they show that you know how to do things correctly.
I would think so as well. Another question about labs. What if they don't have ISO accreditation, but let's say they're an FDA testing lab and a FERN laboratory member, and they undergo proficiency testing? Can this be used in lieu of ISO testing or ISO accreditation? How would you look at that?
Well, that would have to be determined if that is an equivalent standard, because I believe the code says ISO 17065 or an equivalent standard. So we would have to see.
Yeah, you would have to demonstrate how that FDA testing lab would be equivalent to accreditate to 17025. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. So another question on internal labs. Okay, let me see where we are. So it's more about training about employees. Would an annual food safety and quality policy employee presentation coupled with competency testing help with compliance for training?
Well, you probably want to combine training your staff annually in your lab procedures and have some hands-on evaluations as well to make sure all of your lab technicians are equally competent by doing an internal laboratory challenge, giving them the exact same sample and seeing what results come out of that to see if everyone is within a certain close error range or accuracy range, if you will, and then send that sample out as well to an external lab and see what they find versus what your team found. That would be really a much better way to help gauge calibration amongst your own internal lab staff.
Question about recertification audits. For a recertification audit, so if the desk audit is prior to May and the on-site is after May, would we be looking at 9.0? So let me just tell you about the implementation date. So May 24th is when audits begin. So if your audit is scheduled on May 24th or after May 24th, then you would be to edition 9. If your certification audit is scheduled on May 24th or after May 24th, it would be to edition 9. In edition 9, we eliminated the desk audit requirement for initial certifications. So you don't have to worry about when the desk audit is scheduled. If your site audit is scheduled for May 24th or beyond, then it would be to edition 9. For recertification for unannounced audits, that gets a little tricky. So edition 9, like I said, if it's if your audit is going to be on May 24th or beyond, then it would be to edition 9. If you're one of those lucky sites that has a recertification audit date right on the cusp of May 24th and you don't know if your unannounced audit is going to be May 24th or earlier, then I always tell the sites to hope for the best and prepare for the worst, and you determine what your worst and your best is, because maybe you want to be audited to edition 9, maybe you want to be audited to edition 8.1. So I would say you would have to be prepared to edition 9 in the case that you would be audited to edition 9. And that is perfectly fine for you to prepare now for edition 9. And I've even said to some sites, work with your CB. They may be doing even if your audit is scheduled to be edition 8.1, they could do a gap assessment between 8.1 and edition 9 and tell you where you would be if this was an edition 9 audit. So you could work with your CB to do a gap assessment that way as well, and that's one way to prepare. So those are the implementation timelines. I just kind of wanted to put that out there for you. So we're going to go for about a couple more minutes. I'll ask a couple more questions. We've kept Kathy and Tammy, or Kathy and Ann for a good half hour extra, and you guys have asked a lot of good questions. So a question on COMAN. So contractual agreements with third-party storage and distribution businesses shall include requirements relating to customer product requirements and compliance with 2332. So that's if you have a third-party storage and distribution business. Just to make sure that the question submitter understands this correctly, this should not pertain to customers that are distributors, correct? Because then that would be a second-party storage and distribution business. So if the site has, just let me repeat the question. Does contractual agreements with third-party storage and distribution businesses pertain to customers that are distributors? Actually, I'm not quite understanding the question. I'm hoping Kathy or Ann does.
I think you need to repeat that.
One more time.
I'm a little lost
so
too.
Contractual agreements with third-party storage and distribution businesses shall include requirements related to customer product requirements and compliance with 2332. So this is new to the SQF code. Just to make sure they understand this correctly, this should not pertain to customers that are distributors.
Right. The section is about contract manufacturers. So that's someone you contract with to manufacture a product that might have your label on it, is my interpretation. So
right, if you're contracting with a third party, that's what it would be applicable to. Yeah.
Manufacturer.
Kathy, do you have any?
I think that's key, is to make sure we see part of the code they're really focusing on here.
So question.
And contact manufacturer is someone who does something to the product usually.
Question on product release. So the question says, our customer takes their product to the warehouse and then waits for the micro before they release it. So it's at the warehouse. So it ships out of the site into a warehouse, and then micro results are waited for. And then they do the release. Is that complying with SQF?
If it complies with your own internal procedures.
Yeah, the key thing here is that you demonstrate control in a contract with that warehouse, that they understand what it means when someone's under test and hold, and that they don't ship things without getting the results from you.
I agree.
The code requires effective communication, and frequently with contracted warehouse, that's in a contract.
Yep. Yeah, it would. That's your positive release program. Then that's your positive release program. As long the intent of that particular requirement, from our perspective, is that you're not going to ship product out that is not suitable for customer, for the consumer, or at the next level, whatever that would be. Alrighty, well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. I know there's still some questions in the chat box. I tried to get to as many as I could, and I know I tried to summarize some of them as well. But whatever questions we didn't get to, we're going to certainly take all of these great questions and make a FAQ doc, and we'll be sending that out to all of you, as well as posting it on our website. So thank you very much for getting that document started. But we'll definitely look at all of these questions, summarize some of them, and provide answers to you all. So thank you very much. Thank you to our presenters, Kathy Crawford and with HACCP Consulting Group, and Ann Cooper with Eagle. We greatly appreciate your support for SQF and your expertise to our program. It really helps us. And thank you to all of you that participated today and for staying the extra 30 minutes. We appreciate you hanging in there, especially in the beginning with our technical difficulties. So many thanks to you all, and we will be in touch, and we'll keep informing you of the additional webinars that we will have, because you all had some great suggestions about having more Ask Us Anything webinars, which I think is a great idea. So we'll keep you posted, and if you haven't subscribed to our training newsletter, I suggest you do so, and it gives you up-to-date information as to when our next training is and when our next webinars will be held. So many thanks to all of you. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.